This is supposed to make everything much more democratic, but it really doesn't, because it means that any schmo can vote in a Democrat or Republican ticket. All you have to do is to sign up as a Democrat or Republican. You don't have to be an actual activist member. So this means anybody can get the nomination. It means that nomination is decided by public relations, by TV ads, by money, whatever it is. You don't have to. It means that the role of the party as such, the party is a mechanism for gathering, collecting ideas and principles, gets eliminated. And the political party is now just a shell. Democrats or Republican Party don't mean anything. It's all, because of the compulsory primary system, it's all up for grabs. And this is now admitted by most political scientists. It's a terrible thing. They think it all came in the 1960s. It really started coming in 1900 with the progressive, the whole primary concept. And this was deliberately done to destroy the role of the political party as an ideological and vote-gathering movement. In other words, as a group which means something. The idea is to make the parties meaningless and leave a power vacuum for technocrats and progressive, so-called non-partisan scientists. This is all accomplished, and it was all done very cleverly. And one of the things they try to do most is to eliminate the Great War on the cities. By this time, the cities are almost all ethnic. In other words, the cities are mostly liturgical, mostly Irish and Italian and Polish, etc. And the rural areas are mostly WASPS. I'm getting them out of the point where this is more and more true. And so the big cities become a focus of attack by WASP pietists as being sinful per se, as being nests of evil and sin. The whole rural versus urban thing really comes in about this time as an attack on urban ethnics. And one of the things that's become most important now, again, for WASP pietists is to smash the saloon. So have prohibition to eliminate the saloon as a political and political power of ethnic politics. Since most Italian, Irish, etc., Catholic people, the neighborhood saloon still is the focus of politics. And most of the socializing gets done in the saloon, and the saloon keeper becomes the ward heeler, becomes the political power guy you ask who to vote for. And so if you outlaw that, you can smash liturgical politics. So prohibition gets restored now as a big objective. Another thing to do is to try to eliminate city voting altogether. To eliminate the mayor and put in the non-political, quote-unquote, city manager. This is the result of this kind of so-called city manager movement, city commission movement. Very powerful. It took over most of the small cities in the United States. It didn't win out in New York or Philadelphia or Boston, but in most of the small cities, Dayton, Ohio, and most of the Galveston, Texas, they now have city managers. The city manager gets a high salary. The mayor gets almost no salary. The mayor gets $20 a year or something. The mayor, therefore, has very little power. The city manager's in there full time, gets his own bureaucracy in there, and runs everything to his own, mostly to his own liking. Again, this is the political power by the bureaucrats, by the technocrat bureaucrat, taking over from the voters. Voters almost no say in this anymore. You see, they eliminated. Very indirect. Another thing that happens is the nationalization of the public school system. The public schools, until about 1900, were essentially, first of all, they were not compulsory outside New England and Yankee areas. In the South, there's no compulsory attendance laws. And second of all, the public school, remember, the idea of the public school is a Protestantizing device. This comes in even much more now with progressives. If you can't get the Catholic adults are hopeless and steeped in sin, therefore get the kids. Okay? Christianize the Catholics, as they call. You force the kids into the public school system and then Protestantize them to the public schools. So there's a big drive for expansion of the public school system in New York and the South and every place else. Compulsory public school attendance. There's an informal requirement in most jurisdictions. In order to be a public school teacher, you had to be a Protestant church member. It was not official, it was unofficial, but just as important. In San Francisco, you had a constant fight for 50 years between the Catholics and the Protestants in San Francisco, control of the public school system, control of the city in general, and public schools in particular. And behind the public school drive are the upper class and WASPs, upper class business people and WASPs. In many places coincidental. So another thing about public schools is you One, you forced Catholics into it, and Christianized them, quote unquote. And two, business people began to use the public schools as a device to socialize their costs. This is an important form of subsidy we have to realize. One way in which the government subsidizes business is by socializing the cost of business. In other words, taking over some of the costs and loading it onto the taxpayer. For example, in the time of slavery in the South, slavery would not have been efficient, would not have been economic, I should say. Because one of the problems of slavery is that slaves tend to run away. If you have a problem with slaves running away, you don't have a capital equipment. Okay? Machines don't decide to run away. Slaves do. So in order to minimize the cost of enforcement, the slave masters loaded it onto the shoulders of the average white taxpayer in the South by having so-called slave patrols. The slave patrol draft. Every Southerner was required to join a slave patrol for 2 weeks out of a year or something. The slave patrols would patrol the highway, the roads at night, and catch slaves who would run away. A slave patrol had like 5 people on the patrol. Every black person had to have an identity card, something like South Africa. In other words, you have to have an ID card, in this case from your master, telling you where to go, allowing you to go on this particular road. If you didn't have an ID card from your master, you were immediately seized by if they didn't know who your slave master was, the slave patrol people were drafted, by the way. Okay. But the way they got their jollies was, every once in a while they find a slave who didn't have an ID card. They didn't know who the slave master was, and they would then own the slave. They assume homestead ownership of the slave and sell the slave at auction and get the proceeds. This is the way they got their little boodle, part of the loot. So in the same way, in a sense, the same way that the slave masters were able to load the slave patrol costs onto the shoulders of the average white person in the South, in the same way, the public school system socialized a lot of business costs. For example, businessmen began to want to send a lot of salesmen to South America. They said, when do they get their businessmen to learn Spanish? Well, how do they get the guy to learn Spanish? You either have to train them themselves at their own cost, or else you get the public school system to teach them Spanish. What the hell? Load the cost onto the taxpayer. So the national NAM and other business groups began to agitate that public schools should teach Spanish, so that then they can take the guy who's already trained in Spanish. You're loading the cost onto the taxpayers, what it amounts to. So with all this, and in addition to this, you have the professional educationists, who John Dewey and other so-called progressives, who are talking about the new theory of progressive education. Every individual, instead of becoming an individual, just learns to be part of a group, part of a collective, so to speak, and fits into the collective. And this, of course, suited very well this new kind of progressive doctrine. You fit into the collective, whatever it is, government or business agency, without causing any trouble. So you have a whole municipal reform movement. Part of the public school movement, by the way, see, in the old days, public school used to be decentralized. The school boards were voted on by each neighborhood. The parents of each neighborhood, they would vote for the school board in that neighborhood. This is the general way in which most schools were operated. This is considered inefficient, too democratic, too much control of the parents. The theory of progressive educators was only educationists know how to teach a kid. Parents know nothing. Educationists know everything, because they got a PhD in education, teachers college. Okay? So you have a total graph of power on the part of the educationists, and part of the graph of power was that you minimize the voting procedure. First of all, you have huge school board covering the whole city, okay? And the school board hopefully appointed by the superintendent of schools, or appointed by the mayor, let's say. Excuse me, the superintendent. So this eliminates the parents' role altogether. In other words, the whole idea was that huge districts, the parents wouldn't know who the administrators are anyway, and have the mayor, you have to elect the mayor, no way to get around that, but you have everything then appointed by the mayor. The mayor appoints the superintendent, the school board, and all that. Everything becomes a cozy technocratic thing with the parents having no say in the matter. This is, of course, is what happened after 1900. It's part of a progressive situation. In the 1960s, there was a slight move away from this, in the so-called New Left period, where in New York, for example, we now have regional school parent elections with after tremendous blockage, or tremendous opposition by the entrenched teachers' unions, who were battling this to the hilt. But at any rate, this is an ideological drive in the name of so-called value-free science, value-free education, to grab control of the kids on the part of the professional educationists, who are in with upper-class WASP types. This whole thing fitted in beautifully. Also, another thing about urban reform is, in addition to city manager, before 1900, you had the ward district. For example, the legislature in New York City was a so-called Board of Aldermen. And you had a lot of, each small neighborhood would have its own alderman. You had like 400 people on the Board of Aldermen. It means that everybody more or less knew their alderman. So you have a certain amount of democratic check on a situation. You can put pressure on your alderman. You knew who he was, and you put pressure on him. In order to take power out of the hands of ethnic, liturgical, Irish, Italian, etc. ethnics, in the name of so-called efficiency, the progressives then changed all that to make very big, very small city council. Instead of 400 people, you have 20 people. Right? You reduce that. And you run them preferably at large for the whole city. So nobody knows, first of all, nobody knows any of your representatives. And second of all, it's very costly to run an at-large election. It means to run for the whole New York or whole San Francisco costs a lot of money. You have to be quite wealthy or have wealthy backers to do it. To run from, East Bay Ridge costs very little. To run from the whole city costs a lot. In this way, they deliberately got rid of most of the working class, poor working class, and ethnic supporters, or ethnic administrators, and shifted the control of the city to a few upper-class WASPs, upper-class WASP businessmen. This is all done deliberately. In other words, I'll quote a few things, but Weinstein has a lot of this, and there are other sources if you're interested. There's all sorts of data on this thing. This was done in Pittsburgh and Des Moines, etc. There are data about how originally, say, Pittsburgh had a lot of working-class aldermen. Then they shift this thing, and you wind up with a few upper-class businessmen and upper-class physicians. That's in the name, again, of efficiency. So this is done in Rochester. George Eastman does it, Eastman Kodak sets up a Bureau of Municipal Research in the name of so-called good government, business-like efficiency. It's all done in order to shift the political power from working-class liturgicals and liturgical machines to upper-class businessmen. It all fits. The ethnic and the economic all fit in. Pittsburgh, for example, the drive for so-called reform was led by the Civic Club and the Voters League, which were both upper-class WASP groups, essentially businessmen, bankers, corporate officials, and their wives and physicians. So in general, before the progressive reforms, cities were decentralized. There were confederations of local wards. They were quite democratic. There were local working-class representatives and middle-class representatives. In Pittsburgh, for example, in 1910, before the reform period, the city council consisted of about 300 members or so, of which 2/3 were small businessmen or workers. In other words, 2/3 were either employed clerks, laborers, or grocers, and things like that. After the reform movement took over, you have almost all were big businessmen, professional managers, and WASP types. There's all sorts of data on this to deal with. It happens in city after city, Pittsburgh and Galveston and Dayton, et cetera, et cetera. In Pittsburgh, many of these cities didn't want to have a city manager reform. What they did is in the United States, what you have to realize is that cities are a pure tool of the state. I mean, constitutionally, the state has total power over every city within the state. So in Pennsylvania, for example, when Pittsburgh resisted the idea of this progressive reform, the Pennsylvania legislature simply ordered Pittsburgh to do it. They just took over Pittsburgh. They seized Pittsburgh, kicked out the mayor, kicked out the school board, and put in their own people. So, for example, Pittsburgh got dominated by the governor simply kicked out the city council, appointed a new city council based on this at-large voting. And of the 9 people in it, they had 6 upper-class businessmen and 2 upper-class doctors, and 1 kept union official. And the school board the state appointed, in order to change this whole school board thing. They again had 10 big businessmen, 1 upper-class doctor, and 1 kept union official. So it's totally different from the way it had been elected before that. Now, one of the ways in which they did this, one of the areas of agitation was so-called corruption, reform versus corruption. So one thing we have to realize is this is really an ideological. It was an ideological attack on the big city machines, which are quote corrupt unquote. Actually, they're no more corrupt than others; they're just more visible. For example, if some small town upstate New York is corrupt, it's very small. If New York City is corrupt, as we've seen recently, it's huge. Hundreds of millions of dollars get siphoned off. So big city corruption is more visible, and then also it's more visible in another sense. See, the guys who are doing it, if you have a reform group, you give a business a contract above cost, it's less visible than, say, somebody like Lindenauer just taking money out of the till. more raffish in the case of Windsor. It's more visible, so to speak. It's less smooth, put it that way. So we have then, as the use by the reformers of the corruption charge, much of which is, I think, it's misfiring. For example, in New York, in the big business machines in the 1900s or so, instead of having a big welfare system, you had a lot of poor people, you had more poor people than you have now proportionally. You didn't have any welfare state. What you had was Tammany Hall, let's say, which is the New York, Manhattan Democratic Party, known as Tammany Hall. The way they would take care of the poor is they have like a private welfare mechanism by the political party structure. In other words, they give away free turkeys at Christmas and at Thanksgiving. They have big, turkey dinners for the poor, handled by the Democratic Party, local Democratic Party. It's kind of lovable. So you have a sort of a private welfare state organized by the Democratic Party. This way, of course, they buy the vote. In other words, the people would be grateful to the local Democratic Party and vote Democratic. In a sense, there's nothing much wrong with that. It's sort of like a tit-for-tat situation where they fix traffic tickets. When I was growing up, for example, the local Democratic clubhouse person would fix traffic tickets and also fix jury service. He didn't want a jury summons. He handed the local Democratic leader, and he would quote, take care, unquote, the jury summons. This is, I suppose, corruption. It's also helpful corruption. It's helpful to the public. It's getting the public off their neck. And also alleviating poverty, to many extent, out of essentially non-governmental, at least it's not funded by the taxpayer. It's funded in general, I guess, from government office. So it's kind of a raffish kind of corruption, which is not really as unfortunate, I think, as non-corrupt big government, so to speak. There's worse things in the world than corruption. One of them is incorruptible government. In communist countries now, for example, the only way they can operate at all is by having a huge amount of corruption, by bribery and so forth. If they didn't have any bribery, the whole country would fall apart. They wouldn't be able to produce anything. So it's a question of which you choose. Another thing they did was, as a result of this reform government, they had a much bigger government pool of taxes to have municipal garbage disposal, municipal construction, new sewers, new bridges, contracts for businessmen, and much more money to play around with. Welfare departments, playgrounds, all these things now come in with so-called non-corrupt reform governments. In other words, reform government turns out to be a much bigger government than non-reform. I'll just give you one quote before the break. H.L. Mencken, my favorite writer, was a German-American growing up in Baltimore, a great story in his autobiography of his attitude to reform, he said, was set by when his father was a small cigar manufacturer in Baltimore, had an experience with corruption, co-corruption, and quote, reform, unquote. He said his father had a cigar factory in Baltimore. He hung out a sign in 1885 outside the factory saying, August Mencken and Brothers. He called in his corrupt city councilman, so-called corrupt city councilman. He said, look, here's $20. For $20, you keep the government off my neck forever. In other words, the agreement was you pay the city councilman $20. In return for which he takes care of all easements, fees, license requirements, all the rest of this crap. As Mencken said, this is in full settlement forevermore of all present and privilege fees, all permit and privilege fees, easement taxes, and other such costs and imposts. The city councilman pocketed the money. In return, was supposed to stave off any cops, building inspectors, or other functionaries who had any lawful interest in the matter, or try to horn in for private profit. Being an honorable man according to his lights, he, at least the city councilman, kept his bargain, and the sign flapped and squeaked in the breeze for 10 years. In other words, from 1885 to 1895, Mencken and Company was free of all government fees, because the city councilman pocketed $20 and kept the government off his neck. Then he says in 1895, a reform wave struck Baltimore, and the reformers came in, the city councilman was kicked out, and quote, the idealists in the city hall sent word that a license to maintain the sign would cost $62.75 a year. In other words, he had paid $20 for 10 years, essentially. It would now cost $62.75 a year. This was proof to the sign came down the next day. This was proof to my father that reform was mainly only a conspiracy of prehensile charlatans to mulch the taxpayers. And Mencken says that, and he believed that political corruption was inevitable under democracy and was even argued out of his own experience that it had its uses. So anyway, this is Mencken's view of the reform movement. I think he was right. On the urban reform front, since in the cities WASPS are on a minority after all, and liturgicals and working class are majority, the way in which the reformers, which is almost always upper class WASP, the way they can win out from time to time is by using moral arguments, by saying that the big city machines are corrupt, they're boss-ridden. It's true they're corrupt and boss-ridden, but there are things worse than boss-ridden corruption, namely reformers, and alleged efficiency, which really winds up with tremendously increased raise on the taxpayer. Plus, of course, pietist elimination or wiping out of entrepreneurial activities like gambling, prostitution, etc. So one of the things which reformers use, one of their moral arguments, is attack on so-called organized crime. And there's a very interesting article in Journal of American History I recommend in December 1970 called Urban Crime and Criminal Justice, the Chicago case, which really deals with how the whole class struggle around organized crime, with the reformers using of course, the argument of the ethnic bosses or in league with organized crime, and using this as an argument to have state corporatist control over the city. And this turns out, for example, in the legal profession, the corporate lawyers, a big class struggle between the corporate lawyers and the criminal lawyers. The corporate lawyers, of course, the elite in the legal profession. They make a lot more money than Wall Street law firms. The criminal lawyers tend to be less polished. They're raffish types, often in Brooklyn, and they're less suave, etc. And they're attacked as being affiliated with organized crime. Of course, everybody's entitled to a lawyer. So if somebody is a criminal up for indictment, he's going to turn to some lawyer or other, and criminal lawyers, therefore, often tarred with a brush of being quasi-criminal themselves. It seems to be unfair, since everybody's entitled to some lawyer. And so, but as a matter of fact, there's now a drive on by the legal profession to limit the fees that criminal lawyers get, to put a cap. Of course, they're not putting any cap on corporate lawyers. It's all part of this class struggle, so to speak, between WASP business corporate types and more raffish ethnic types. I remember at one point, about 20 years ago, Jacob Fuchsberg was a distinguished criminal lawyer in New York, ran for the State Court of Appeals, which is the highest New York State judicial arm, and he was bitterly attacked by the entire corporate law profession. He was very upset with it. He's a criminal lawyer. He has no business the Court of Appeals people should always be corporate Wall Street lawyers. Well, there's no divine commandment that has to be a corporate lawyer, but there's a big fight against them. And one of the ways in which the WASP reformers can use their moral outlet is the media, of course. The media is usually, of course, WASP controlled. And so what you have then in the cities, New York, Chicago, etc., whatever, the reformers are pushed by the New York Times, let's say, which is not WASP, but is a typical reformer outfit. And so you have then prestige or respectable newspaper behind the reformers. In New York, for example, which is, of course, largely a Democratic Party city, was run by a reform fusion ticket for about all during the 1930s. Mayor LaGuardia was elected by a Republican fusion government, fusion party, and coming in on the wave of so-called reform. To get even more ethnic here, it's interesting that the Italian Americans, for example, have been very difficult to make it politically until very, very recently, of course, with Cuomo. Before that, in New York State, the only Italians Americans who succeeded politically were Protestant Italians. It's a very small percentage of the Italian American population is Protestant. You can imagine, maybe 1%. But somehow, the Italian Americans in politics who made it politically until very recently were Protestant. LaGuardia and Procora, people like that who Italian Protestants, therefore, coming from a very small percentage of the Italian population, not really in with basic Italian Americans. So, of course, we're Catholic. So again, this is all part of a WASP versus Catholic and High Lutheran struggle. And again, an attack, since big city machines were basically Irish, I said, after 1900 or so, where the Protestant WASP were kicked out, and so you had basically old Calvinist WASP, basically had the city machines were Irish, and so an attack on the big city bosses essentially was an anti-Irish or anti-Catholic assault in the name of so-called reform. So what you had then is the reformers were able to capture the high moral ground. There's very few people who can take a sophisticated argument in favor of corruption. The argument basically is the Mencken argument. It's better to be corrupt and have an efficient, high-tax government. It's very difficult to make that argument, and basically, so the reformers then can use the media, the press, etc., taking a high moral tone and attacking everybody else as being immoral, which is basically their view. Also, along with this comes upper class WASP moral theorists, so to speak. Upper class females who start running around 1900 the social work movement, social worker. Settlement house movement. Jane Addams, people like that who were a whole bunch of WASP reformers. Jane Addams in Chicago, Seth Lowe in New York, a whole bunch. Jacob Reese Housing. All these people were upper class WASP millionaires, and Jane Addams was the daughter of an upper class WASP millionaire, coming in to help uplift the poor. It was known those days as uplift. In other words, you are upper class females, let's say, coming in and uplifting the Lower East Side. How do you uplift? Well, of course, you hand out food and so forth. But basically, the uplift is also using compulsion, kicking out, getting rid of sweatshop employers, which really meant getting rid of employers, getting rid of conditions they didn't like, getting rid of prostitution, saloons. Prohibition comes in beautifully. All these people were prohibitionists. And prohibition was part of the idea of uplifting the poor. You uplift the poor by stamping out immoral conditions. Immoral conditions meant liquor, saloon, prostitution, pornography, whatever. So all this was part of the moral reform movement, part of the progressive seizure of power on a local level. Another way to do this is known as urban imperialism. This is something which is very little known. I know of only one book that really mentions this in any length, Milton Kotler, in a book called Neighborhood Government. One of the ways in which the cities grew in this period is by seizing power over the other areas. In other words, much of the urban political growth, urban population growth from 1900 to 1910 was not growth by people being born or people migrating. It was growth in the sense of seizing control over, by expanding the city geography. In other words, originally, in 1900, New York City was Manhattan, okay? And then Brooklyn was its own city. Actually, Brooklyn was a combination of a whole bunch of different cities. Flatbush, New Dorp, all these were originally cities. Brooklyn was the fourth largest city in the United States in 1900. It was seized by New York. Manhattan had conquered the Bronx by that time. And seized in this sense, compulsorily seizure. Brooklyn did not want to be amalgamated to New York. So New York went to the New York State Legislature. New York State Legislature forced Brooklyn into it. In other words, the state legislature, remember, is all powerful. And so this happened in Philadelphia, it happened in Pittsburgh, where the cities would just simply incorporate areas, other cities around it. Philadelphia crushed Germantown, seized Germantown by using the Pennsylvania legislature. In other words, these cities, Brooklyn did not want to be incorporated into New York. Germantown did not want to be incorporated into Philadelphia. It's simply they use the state legislature to force these other cities into it. It's been called urban imperialism over its neighbors. I think what the heck, it's a pretty good term here. So what was the accomplishment here? What they did is you bring in more tax revenue. In other words, many of these areas, for example in Pittsburgh, which grabbed a whole bunch of neighboring cities, and there was more. These cities, these downtowns, for example, let's take Pittsburgh, was originally built around the railroad terminals. Okay? In other words, before automobiles came in and trucks came in, the city you had a railroad terminal and cities were built around it. You had factories and people living there, etc. So the downtowns were heavily indebted with railroad bonds and so forth, subsidized railroads. They're paying heavy taxes on these bonds. If you grab a whole bunch of other cities around it, incorporate it into Pittsburgh, then you can tax these guys to pay for the railroad bonds. That's essentially what happened. In other words, you use this downtown businessmen are heading up the inner city, seize power in the suburbs, bring them into the city, and then tax them. That's basically the point. Assess these buildings at a higher rate, so forth and so on. So, and especially New York is the same thing in Brooklyn and the Bronx, which was really part of Westchester. This happened a lot between 1900 and 1910. This growth of urban imperialism that annexed neighboring towns and neighboring cities, bring them into the tax base. There has been for many years now a so-called metro movement. The idea is to grab Westchester, let's say, and grab parts of Nassau, force them into New York City and tax them. In other words, it's really just a tax gimmick to bring these poor guys into a higher tax bracket and get downtown New York for the subsidies. So anyway, this process happened during the 19th century, but in this progressive period it reached its peak. So they deliberately, for example, in Pittsburgh, they deliberately taxed the other wards much more heavily than the downtown wards. Much higher assessment per dollar property on the outlying wards that they were taking over. In Pittsburgh, for example, in 1912, after the compulsory seizure of Allegheny and other towns incorporated into Pittsburgh, the old rate, well, in one case, Bookhoven, which was a new town incorporated into Pittsburgh, was paying 90 times the property tax, than the old third ward, the old downtown third ward. That's, of course, very unusual. It's usually not that big a range. But basically, that's what happens. You take the new ward, you tax them more heavily than the old one, and thereby subsidize the downtown, heavily debt-ridden downtown area. Brooklyn was annexed in 1898 by the New York City collaboration with the New York State Legislature. So, for example, Pittsburgh grew from 1900 to 1910, grew from a population of 320,000 to 530,000, largely by incorporating other areas, not by real growth. Doesn't mean it really grew, in the sense of growth per mile, simply just by incorporating other regions into Pittsburgh. And as this happened, as the cities got larger and larger, it meant that as the city councils got smaller, remember, because they're being voted on at large, and school boards got smaller and at large, it meant that the representatives per person got less and less. In other words, the cities got larger, the city councils got smaller in number and larger and representing more people. You wind up with less and less democratic voting. Fewer and fewer government officials per person in the city council. For example, in the Columbus, Ohio, for example, in the 1830s had one city council member for every 100 people. We had 2,000 people and 20 city councilmen. So, and that's the situation. Everybody obviously knew their city councilman. I could more or less ride herd over them. Jimmy is goofing up, get him to change his vote, pay him a visit. By the current period, Columbus, Ohio has 500,000 people, right, instead of 2,000, and has 9 city councilmen. So you have one city councilman for every 50,000 people instead of for every 20 people, and for every 100. You obviously have much smaller representation per person than you had before. Anyway, to get back to the social work movement, which becomes a professional uplift movement in around 1900, with Jane Addams, who was the daughter of one of the richest men in Illinois. Mary Kingsley, same way, a whole bunch of them, Lillian Wall and the Henry Street Settlement, and again, bringing in professional social work, trying to stamp out alleged immorality, and making social work from a charitable thing into a profession, people living off of. And many of the New Deal officials in the 1930s came out of the social work movement. Most of the women New Dealers, for example, were originally upper class social workers in this Hull House, Settlement House movement. Eleanor Roosevelt came out of that, and Francis Perkins, Secretary of Labor, and a whole bunch of others. Part of the public school reform movement was to also run the whole kit. The cry was, take the schools out of politics. In other words, don't have people voting for school boards, have it appointed by the mayor, have professional educationists do it. As one historian says, the reformers' battle cry, take the school out of politics, not only meant take the schools out of the hands of Tammany Hall, but also out of the hands of the Roman Catholic Church. In other words, the idea was you make it into a Protestantizing device. Take it out of the hands of the ward boss and into the hands of the technocratic educationists. And also the idea is you run the whole kit. In other words, the educationists had the idea the whole kit should be molded by the professional educators and molded into the system, molded in how to conform and so forth and so on, which is essentially what they did. Also from this came the idea of reducing content of the schools and making it into a sort of a general socializing device. Elwood Cubberley, who was a major historian of education, a big educationist, big progressive educator, summed it all up in 1916, summed up the idea of school reform, and he said, one of the important results of the change from ward representation to election from the city at large is that the inevitable representatives from these poor wards is eliminated, representation is eliminated, and the board comes to partake of the best characteristics of the city as a whole. I mean, of course, the upper class pietists. What he called the better elements. Who he said are the better elements who are now making up the school board? Quote, men who are successful in their handling of large business undertakings, manufacturers, merchants, bankers, contractors, and professional men of large practice. I mean, of course, doctors would perhaps come first. This is an open recognition that the whole idea of the school reform is to take over, seize the control of the schools from the hands of the ethnic people's representatives to technocrats and big businessmen. And also to take these new immigrants, mostly Catholic, and homogenize them into becoming good Protestants, as far as possible, of course. Prohibition was a great example, a marvelous example of the combination of a moral uplift, pseudo-science, pseudo-value-free science, technocracy, and smashing the ethnic politics, liturgical politics. All these guys combined to a drive for prohibition, which only first gets here in World War I, but is revved up during the Progressive period. WASP big businessmen attacked the idea of liquor as, quote, an enemy of efficiency. In other words, the workers are allowed to drink, they get drunk, and the absenteeism goes up. I suppose it might. So therefore, if we prevent the workers from getting drunk by eliminating alcohol, outlawing alcohol. You notice, for example, in Disney World, it's a beautiful example of the best and worst of WASP capitalism. Disney, if you've ever been to Disney World, it's a magnificently run, beautifully run outfit. I mean, everything is private, of course. The sewers are private, the streets are private. Everything works beautifully. I mean, the bathrooms are spick and span. It's all great. However, you can't get any liquor there. Liquor is, if you wander around Disney World forever, you get non-alcoholic punch. Okay. Because liquor, of course, all these people still have this pietist view that somehow liquor is, if you have liquor at all, it should only be for the wealthy. The masses shouldn't be allowed to drink. And so you can drink liquor by checking in a Disney World hotel, and there you have a cocktail lounge, which does have liquor. But the masses, that means the rest of us are wandering around the streets there, can't get any liquor. It's great except for that. Of course, it's a real blight. George Pullman had his own private, the founder of Pullman Cars, was a progressive businessman. He had his own city, Pullman, Illinois, now part of Chicago, for the workers. The idea of the workers would live there and rent houses. His workers would live in Pullman, Illinois, and rent his houses. And and it was supposed to be a well-planned city, sort of a privately planned city for his workers. Unfortunately, what happened was that he engaged in pietist moral domination of these people. In other words, there'd be Gestapo-type checks, raids on every home, and make sure everybody walking around with jackets. The men were always supposed to wear jackets at all times, not be in shirt sleeves. To prevent shirt sleeves, to be raids on the porch and busting on the home and make sure everybody's got jackets on. Of course, there was no liquor available, no pornography, of course, and no liquor was available in all of Pullman, Illinois. So the masses began to get restless, edgy as a result. They'd sneak across the border to free, whatever the name is, Decatur, Illinois, to get liquor and all the other sinful delights of big cities. And the famous strike of the Pullman Railroad workers in the 1890s was basically a result of this, living conditions getting more and more edgy and restless under this moral domination of this creep who's trying to uplift them and shape them up. So you had then you have the efficiency argument that workers shouldn't be allowed to drink because otherwise they have absenteeism. The moral argument that liquor is sinful. And, for example, Walter Rauschenbusch, the famous social gospeler, the head of the social gospel movement, said, quote, the liquor industry is, 1912, he wrote a book called Christianizing the Social Order. Very interesting title, Christianizing the Social Order. He said, quote, the liquor industry is seeking to fasten on an angry people a relic of barbarism which the awakened conscience and the scientific intellect of the world are combining to condemn. The awakened moral conscience against liquor and scientific intellect. Why should the scientific intellect? Because liquor is unscientific. Liquor leads to absenteeism, at least to liver trouble. Well, there's lots of arguments against liquor. It makes fun. Nowadays, there's a return of prohibition sentiment. You drink liquor, it tends to have car accidents. Okay? So therefore, ban liquor. That seems to be the conclusion. So as a result, you have this mighty prohibitionist movement. on religious grounds and on so-called scientific grounds. Now, the scientists were usually also WASP pietists. In other words, the one hat was WASP pietists, and the other hat they were value-free scientists saying we should outlaw liquor, but the liquor will lead to more accidents and liver trouble and God knows what. And particularly, this of course was an assault on German Lutheran and Catholic beer drinking, and this is a fantastic clash over beer. The Germans loved beer, and beer was of course part of alcoholic beverages. It was a fantastic clash over that. Reverend Josiah Strong, social gospeler, prominent social gospel person, said in 1909 that high wages are bad because you buy drink with them and acquire the liquor habit before the workers have developed a more refined taste of a higher civilization. In other words, the workers aren't ready for high wages yet because they'll drink. They have more refined taste eventually. I don't know what they'd be doing with refined taste. Anyway, Strong also attacked what he called personal liberty in 1914. He said, quote, this is a fascinating quote, he said, personal liberty is at last, after many years of progressivism, personal liberty is at last an uncrowned, dethroned king with no one to do him reverence. We are no longer frightened by that ancient bogey paternalism in government, which of course the liturgicals have been attacking for decades. We affirm boldly it is the business of government to be just that, paternal. Nothing human can be foreign to a true government, unquote. It was a function of government to run everything, regulate everything, probe in everybody's life. The scientific argument, which went along with the so-called scientific argument for liquor, for prohibition, is of course that it says the uplift, the poor are now being destroyed by liquor, we should therefore outlaw it. It has harmful effects. If people drink too much, they, liver trouble, whatever. And since according to the new so-called scientists, people are determined by their environment, therefore you have to change the environment. How do you change the environment? You eliminate liquor. Because part of people's evil environment is the ability to buy liquor. So all these pseudo-scientific arguments are being called into being here. Plus, progressive sociologists and social scientists like Edward A. Ross, one of my least favorite people. He was a disciple of Commons and Ely. Edward Ellsworth Ross, professor of sociology at University of Wisconsin. Also a big racist. We have to realize that allegedly scientific racism now comes in here as part of the progressive movement. All these Wisconsin people had it. They believe that non-Anglo-Saxons were inferior races, most, of course, including Italians, Poles, Irish, etc., who are Catholics. It all tends to fit in, you see. Other races are inferior and should be kept out of, and should be, of course, not allowed to immigrate to the United States. This is part of the immigration restriction movement, which is also an attack on liturgicals. It now gets a scientific patina as being determined by biology, by social Darwinism biology. So biology is now brought in as an allegedly scientific reason to eliminate immigration of Catholic and Jews later and so forth countries. Ross is one of the leading figures in this, as well as advocating state control of almost everything. The economic argument, as I said, is necessary for workers to be sober. If you allow them to drink, they'll be absent more. And another thing is that the drive for prohibition came about because the railroads were getting to be liable. Liability laws were coming in. Railroads were liable for accidents caused by their engineers or firemen or whatever. So if you have the wrong switch, you have an accident. The railroads became liable. The railroads now wanted to start making rules that their engineers or whatever can't drink even off duty. It's like pilots now can't drink, I think, 12 hours before they fly or something, that sort of thing. So the railroads began to enforce temperance on their own employees, and then of course they said, well, look, if we have temperance voluntarily, let's get the government to pass compulsory temperance for our competitors. So, therefore, they start agitating for prohibition. Another group in favor of prohibition, I kid you not, was the Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola in those days was a big competitor to alcohol, had some cocaine in it. That, by the way, was the origin of the word coca, from the coca leaf. Had a little bit of cocaine in it, which apparently gave you a certain kick. It's disappeared long since from the formula. So Coca-Cola were big competitors to liquor. Coca-Cola was one of the main agitators for prohibition. If you outlaw your competitor, these people have to turn to Coke. for getting the missing kick. Well, another big lobbyist in favor of prohibition was Welch's grape juice, which of course came in communion when wine was outlawed. They turned to Welch's grape juice. By the way, grape juice, most Protestant churches already had Welch's grape juice as the communion drink. So Welch's grape juice is a big competitor to wine. They were lobbying for prohibition. Two prominent business lobbyists for prohibition, eliminate their competition. The Catholics, of course, and Lutherans were heavily against prohibition. The Catholic businessmen like DuPont were leading the fight against prohibition and were during the 1930s. The unions were sort of split. They didn't know what to do. Most unions were WASP unions, were in favor of prohibition. Socialist unions, Knights of Labor originally. The Railroad Brotherhoods were in favor of prohibition. On the other hand, of course, the brewery workers were also unionized, and they were, of course, against prohibition. It means their livelihood would be taken away from them, distillery and brewery workers. So the AFL was sort of split. They didn't take an official position on it because they had brewery workers. But most of the socialists and labor union people were in favor of prohibition. They attacked the liquor industry. They took the usual leftist line that somehow businessmen were creating demand. So if people wanted liquor, it wasn't their fault because the evil businessmen were supplying them with alcohol. And so therefore you have to attack the liquor lobby. The social workers, of course, were all in favor of abolishing the saloon. Here's a great quote from a prominent social worker, Paul Benjamin, who wrote in the Survey magazine, which is one of the big progressive publications, in 1915. He said, "Abolish the saloon, quote, and the task of Americanizing the conglomerate foreign population will be lightened by 50%, unquote. In other words, Americanizing meaning making good Protestants out of them, is what it really amounts to. So again, it's all part of the same sort of shtick. And as the war begins to, as World War I begins to loom, and America begins to join the war effort, anti-German hysteria becomes part of the argument for prohibition. As we'll see later, one of the great quotes was that the biggest German agents in this country, the most important German agents, are not spies, but their names are Schlitz, Bush, Budweiser, whatever, Pabst, Miller. In other words, the German brewers who are subverting American boys by subverting their moral fiber and supplying them with beer. The Anti-Saloon League said, quote, "The German brewers in this country have rendered thousands of men inefficient and are thus crippling the Republic in its war against Prussian militarism." Unquote. So, in other words, the war, the entry into World War I, supplied the final push over the top. The anti-German hysteria, and therefore the anti-beer hysteria along with it, provided the opportunity for the Democratic Party to impose prohibition, notice. As we'll see, Wilson, by this time, of course, is a progressive, and oddly enough, prohibition comes to the United States as a democratic maneuver during World War I. Actually, it comes, excuse was American boys, American soldiers have to be protected from liquor. And so first they sort of made all bars off limits and so forth. Then they decided, well, the best way to do it is to eliminate liquor altogether by outlawing it and making it unconstitutional. So that as a result of World War I, liquor becomes an insane thing, a constitutional amendment saying that all liquor is outlawed. Both the possession and the sale and production of liquor becomes unconstitutional. I mean, it's incredible it could even be a constitutional amendment, but that's the way it was as a result of World War I. One prohibitionist said, this is the quote, "We have German enemies in this country too. I mean, the worst of all German enemies, the most treacherous, the most menacing are Pabst, Schlitz, Blatz, and Miller." These are the beer, of course, the big beer manufacturers. Generally, the medical profession was free until the late 19th century, 1900. In the Jacksonian period, which was a real free market period in the United States, the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, all licensing was eliminated in almost every profession, including medicine. The American Medical Association, which is and always has been the guild or the union of physicians, put through a medical licensing law in 1847. No, excuse me, they founded AMA in 1847. And they put through a medical licensing law around the 1860s, but it didn't really take. It was too easy to avoid it, and there was no real enforcement. So you could just get a license for $10 or something. So the American Medical Association had as its goal, founded in 1847, to cartelize the medical profession. In other words, to kick out the licensed medical schools and hospitals and restrict the supply of doctors so as to increase their income. It's very simple. In other words, you shift the supply to the left, reduce the number of doctors, and thereby increasing their prices they can charge. They realized the medical school is the key. If you can license medical schools and kick medical schools out of business, cut the supply in half of medical schools, you can then, of course, restrict as the future doctors, younger doctors coming up. Most of these licenses, true in medicine too. One of the criteria you can tell by whether a license is pushed in order to help the public, as it's supposed to be, the argument is always that general welfare, the common good requires worthy professionals, engineers, doctors, photographers, barbers, whatever license the occupation happens to be. But the key thing here is, in every situation where a restriction is put on an entry in the profession, the existing people in the profession are exempt. It's the so-called grandfather clause, or grandfathering. In other words, the existing people are grandfathered in. In the barbering occupation, for example, every 10 or 20 years they put more restrictions on the supply of barbers. They say in order to be a barber, you have to have 4 years of barber school. You have to pass a course in the history of barbering and the ethics of barbering. You have to be a citizen. You have to be 19, 21 years old. I keep raising the age. You have to be a citizen, raising the educational requirements for barbering. All this exempts the existing people. In other words, what they'll say is every new person coming in has to have 4 years of barber education. The existing people can get along the usual 2 years. In that way, the existing people are grandfathered into the profession, and new people are kicked out, kept out. So the fact that the universal fact of grandfathering demonstrates that the purpose of licensing is for cartel purposes, to restrict the entry in the profession rather than, and to increase the income of the existing people rather than helping the public. So from 1847 to 1910, the American Medical Association was lobbying for this sort of restriction. In fact, for a long time, they wanted to license psychologists. There's a constant feud between doctors and psychologists. And the doctors are trying to get all psychologists who don't have MDs kicked out. In other words, declared illegal. And they haven't been able to do it because they're competing lobbies of the psychologists. But there was always been an attempt to do that. William James, the famous philosopher and psychologist, almost kicked out of the profession, was almost drummed out of medicine, for being in favor of non-medical legalizing or to legally permit non-licensed, non-doctor psychologists, even though he himself was a physician. He was almost kicked out of medicine for this heresy. Well, finally what happens is the American AMA sets up a Council on Medical Education in 1904 and gets in with the Carnegie Foundation. And the Carnegie Foundation is the advancement of teaching, also allied with it was the Rockefeller Foundation. Okay? And one of the things that happens as in the early 20th century is that people like Carnegie and Rockefeller begin to set up foundations, allegedly for impartial scientific research. Actually, these foundations, first place, are a tax dodge. In other words, you don't have to pay they're tax exempt. So you don't have to pay inheritance taxes if you give your money to a foundation. And also you control it. So the Rockefeller Foundation funds, for example, the Carnegie Foundation funds can be invested in Standard Oil or whatever the company is and vote the right way. So that's one purpose of foundations is to be able to keep your capital and vote the correct way, so to speak. Another one is to pursue certain purposes which redound to the benefit of the profitability of the corporation or the tycoon promoting the foundation. So that's one thing. Another thing is they use the funds for purposes which redound to the profit of the donor. I don't know if I mentioned the Millbank, New York City Health Department caper, but anyway, the key there is that to sum it up very quickly, in the 1930s, most of the milk in New York City was sold by farmers, independent farmers, in big cans. And then there were grocery stores in those days, not supermarkets. So you go to the grocery store with your bottle, and they dip the milk from the can into your bottle. There was packaged milk or bottled milk in those days, not cartons, sold by Borden and Sheffield. Those were the two major milk companies. All the rest was loose milk, sold at about half the price. Well, coming to the Depression, people turned more and more to loose milk because they couldn't afford the bottled milk. So the Borden and Sheffield, the two major milk companies, turn to the New York City Health Department, and they get the health department to outlaw milk, loose milk, on the basis of safety, with no evidence. And the New York City Health Department sets up a commission, allegedly impartial scientific commission, to study the question of whether or not loose milk is unsafe. And the impartial scientists consist of a couple of guys from the health department. The rest of them are all from the Milbank Fund. Oh, a couple of guys from Sheffield, like the vice president of Sheffield, the vice president of Borden, and 4 or 5 guys from the Milbank Fund. Okay. This impartial committee, after 3 months of investigation, concludes that loose milk is unsafe, and that's it. And the farmers are saying there's no evidence, and besides, the only possible problem might be that the dipper, when you dip the milk, is not sterile, and we're working out on a sterile dipper. So there'll be no problem whatsoever. The dipper, you dip the milk from the can into the bottle, will be sterile. In 2 months, we'll have a sterile dipper, and the health department says, sorry, too late, you're now illegal. From then on, loose milk was declared illegal. Supply of milk was cut in half, the price doubled, and people starved and all that, and Sheffield and Borden benefited. Every state has a milk cartel which restricts production and raises prices. The farmers complained, so in the mid-1930s, about 3 or 4 years after this, the New York State government passed a Milk Act, which got the farmers into the monopoly. In other words, each farm now has, still does, a maximum quota of milk they can produce. And they sell it to a milk board, the New York State Milk Board, which parcels it out and sells it at a high price. In other words, basically what happened was that Sheffield and Borden shared the monopoly profits with the farmers, which shut the farmers up. Of course, the consumers are still suffering. Consumers will have to pay a lot more for less milk. There's also, it's very difficult. You can't sell milk you can't buy New Jersey milk in New York, even though it's right across the river, because of milk protectionism, so to speak. And so the result is a fantastic compulsory cartelization of the milk market. And by the way, what just happened recently is a million dairy cows. The dairy industry still thinks that the prices are too low. And so the federal government is compelling the slaughter of 1 million dairy cows, just like that, so as to cut the production of milk and raise the price. And the cattlemen are bellyaching, because the cattle farmers now find out that since they're killing dairy cows and selling it for meat, this means that there's more competition in the meat industry, so the meat prices are falling, and they're trying to get the federal government to stop killing the dairy cows on their own hook. But of course, nobody cares about the consumer. I mean, it's outrageous. 1 million dairy cows are being slaughtered so as to drive up the price of milk. And nobody's complaining. This is so-called free market government. All right, so what happened, the punchline here is that the Milbank Fund, who is the Milbank Fund? Also, the Milbank Fund, every New York City health commissioner and assistant commissioner are Milbank Fund people. In other words, the pattern was you become vice president of the Milbank Fund, you then become chairman of the New York City Health Commissioner for a year or 3 years, and you go back as president of the Milbank Fund. So a revolving door set up between the Milbank Fund and the New York City Health Department. I gave this lecture on health and medicine and the market to Mount Sinai Medical School people about 10 years ago. I didn't get to this example of the Milbank Fund, and I told the kids who invited me, I said, I had this great example. I told them the story, and you haven't heard the punchline yet. Anyway, I told them the story, and I said, gee, Professor, I'm glad you didn't mention it. I said, why not? He said, because every member of the community health department in Mount Sinai is on the payroll of the Milbank Fund. Every one of them, right now. It's like 10 years ago. So presumably this still exists. The Milbank Fund has a very powerful influence on New York City health. Who is the Milbank Fund? Jeremiah Milbank, the founder, is the owner of the Borden Company. And all the Milbank Fund's investments, of course, are in the Borden Company. So you have, in other words, a beautiful tie-in between Borden Milk Company and the Milbank Fund and running New York City health in a, quote, impartial, not scientific, value-free manner, unquote. Such is the racket under which we're suffering here. Anyway, so this is... So in the medical report, what happens, go back to 1910, the Carnegie and Rockefeller Foundation set up a committee along with the AMA really running it, to investigate medical education in the United States. Abraham Flexner was appointed the head of to make the study, and his report issued in 1910 was called the Flexner Report. It was really written by his guy from the AMA named Colwell, who was at his elbow telling him what to do. I mean, Flexner, he visited every medical school in the United States. He spent like 3 days in each medical school. He was not a physician. He was not an educator. That's why he was very well qualified for this post. Didn't know anything about medicine. Didn't know much about education. I think he was a high school, prep school teacher in social science or something. The question is, why was he appointed, Abraham Flexner? What was his qualification for this high post? And by the way, the recommendation was that there are too many medical schools in the United States, and half of them should be put out of business. They should be licensed by each state, which should then appoint a board, which should give the power to the American Medical Association to appoint the board of examiners, which examine every, not only doctor, but every medical school and every hospital, and decide whether they should stay in business. This was done, and within a year or two, every state in the Union had this model bill, reorganized the medical profession to do this, gave the Medical Association the power to put hospitals and medical schools out of business, and they promptly put half the schools in the United States out of business, literally half. There were 160 medical schools in 1906, and of these, there were 82 left by 1912, and they were all put out of business by these state government law regulations engineered by the Flexner Report. Flexner said there's an oversupply of doctors. What does that mean, oversupply? It means there are too many doctors for the income they like to get. Too many doctors per person. Doctors are not well off enough, therefore we should cut the supply, have higher quality, quote unquote, medical education, and raise their income. And that's compulsory cartelization. Of course, it raises costs, which is something he didn't talk about. So Flexner, what was Flexner's qualification? The only qualification I could see was he was the brother of Dr. Simon Flexner, who was the head physician or whatever, the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research. So here's the guy who's responsible for putting half the medical schools in the country out of business. He's neither a physician nor an educator. His only qualification was he was in with the AMA, and his brother was the head of the Rockefeller Institute. So in response to this, there were, as I say, 162 medical schools in 1906, and they kept progressively putting schools out of business until 1944. There were only 69 medical schools. And each medical school was get tighter and tighter. The number of medical students are pushed to the left. Their income, those who make it, go up. The way he put it was, Flexner, here's a great statement from Flexner. The law that protects the public against the unfit doctor should in fairness protect the student against the unfit school. So you put protecting a student by not allowing any schools. The result now, whenever you have monopolists or cartelists, they will use their power to crush their competition. Competition means people they don't like. For example, if you have price control, if you have rent control, you'll have the landlord takes over housing. He's got 100 applicants for every apartment. He will then choose, since he can't raise the rents, he'll choose on some other basis, namely the people he likes. His brother-in-law will get his brother or brother-in-law will get favored thing, his favored race. If he doesn't like a certain race, he'll keep them out. In other words, the producer then takes over from the consumer. And racial discrimination, religious discrimination then takes over. Same thing happened in medicine. As the medical cartelists took over and used the government to cartelize the medical profession, they used the power systematically to put out of business every medical school. There were several black medical schools that were put out of business as being allegedly below par. There were many women medical students, they were put out of business. In other words, women doctors were pressed, and Jewish doctors were kicked out. So in other words, if you had those medical schools which systematically then excluded women, blacks, and Jews from the medical profession. You had many cases of bright young students who couldn't get into medical school, not because they weren't qualified, because there weren't any places left, and there were quotas against their religion or race. They had to go to Switzerland or somewhere and get the degree there and try to come in as a foreign doctor. So that's still going on. It's not as bad as it used to be, because there's much more, things have loosened up in the last 10 years or so. There's more competition in the medical profession. But, that was the situation, and, they put out of business systematically black medical schools, I'd say, and also medical schools with competing therapies, therapies which didn't fit into the orthodox mold. For example, in those days, the dominant medical therapy was called allopathy, allopath, which, the basic theory, of course, of allopathy is that diseases should be combated by massive doses of synthetic drugs to kill the germs. And this, of course, is very expensive. synthetic drugs were expensive. Also, allopathy before that, the allopaths, their basic therapy consisted of purging, which means massive poisons. You take the guy and purge him with massive doses of arsenic and mercury and things like that, which would usually kill the patient. It was worth your life to go to a doctor until about, the interesting thing on medical historians is when did the break-even point come? In other words, at what point did the doctors cure more people than they killed? And even Orthodox medicine agrees that, well, they say before 1920s. What's a hell of an admission? Here's this medical profession, which is the same sort of people are dominant. It's now agreed they kill more people than they cure. What they did is they purged them with they bled them with leeches, they purged them with arsenic and things like that, and the rest of it was surgery, and so they killed many people. So, and then came massive doses of synthetic drugs. And according to Dr. McKeown, I think is by far the top medical historian, he claims the break-even point came in the late 1930s with the sulfa drugs and penicillin, which really then began to cure people, at least by killing the disease. Before that, it really was worth your life to go to a doctor. So that, at any rate, there was allopathy. The other competing theory, therapy, in those days was about 1/3 of the medical profession, was homeopathy. Invented by a guy named Heinemann, I think in Germany. Homeopathy is still very prominent in Western Europe. It's now essentially illegal in the United States because all the homeopathic schools, every one of them were put out of business after the Flexion Report. In other words, as soon as the AMA, which hated homeopathy, took over, AMA being allopaths, right now allopathy is medicine. Basically, when we talk about medicine, it's allopathy. The homeopaths have been put out of business. The only homeopaths now are either European or old ones, old guys over 80 who still went to medical school before 1915 or 1910. So, a friend of mine went to an elderly homeopath and was cured of diabetes. He was taking insulin, and the homeopath said, well, he said, if you take this little herb, and take very minute doses of natural herbs. That's the homeopathic doctrine. And he said, you take a teeny dose, and this is a 5-year supply. It costs about $3. A 5-year supply of this natural herb, and if you throw away the insulin. He did, and he was in great shape ever since. Now, I'm not endorsing this therapy. I'm simply saying the consumers have a right to choose. So homeopathy is now basically illegal. Also, other suggested cures are illegal. Alleged cancer cures. There's this elderly Romanian doctor, a lovable character, his license is being removed, which means he can't practice medicine anymore by the New York State government. So they claim his cancer cures are not, quote, not effective, unquote. They don't say he's harming them. They just say they're not effective. Well, the patients think they're effective. The patient is on television crying. They say, this guy's keeping them alive. He can't practice anymore because the New York State medical authorities, the New York State government, claim that it's not effective. How do they know it's not effective? Who the hell are they? Not God. But anyway, that's the way they're preventing, so they're outlawing alleged cancer cures. Laetrile, you have to go to Mexico to get Laetrile. And most people only go to so-called crackpot medicine when Orthodox medicine says we can't help you anymore. Usually they're half dead when they get to these things. And they're often helped quite a bit. So, as I say, I'm not endorsing any of these things. I'm simply saying that consumers should have the right to choose. These things should not be illegal. So, and many things which are illegal were legal in Western Europe and illegal here. Although some things are illegal in Western Europe and illegal here. For example, Emperin. You can't get Emperin in Western Europe without a prescription. Emperin is supposed to be dangerous. Well, here it's sold over the counter. By the way, the prescription business is another racket because it means you can't, in order to buy a drug, you have to get a prescription. It means you have to go to a licensed pharmacist. And you have to go to a licensed doctor to get the prescription filled out. So you have in fact, one of my physicians I go to is essentially, what he really is a paid prescription writer. In other words, he says, what prescriptions do you want? And he fills them out. So he performs an important service. On the other hand, it's pretty expensive to have to go through this guy to do it. So the interesting thing here about this Orthodox medicine is that who is the tie-up, just like the tie-up of the Milbank Fund, the Rockefeller Foundation, Simon Flexner, Rockefeller Institute of Medical Research, are the main research for synthetic drugs. In other words, first the Rockefeller people get homeopathy outlawed. So allopathy becomes the only legal medicine. In order to have allopathy, you have to have synthetic drugs, very expensive. The Rockefeller Institute pushes synthetic drug research. And the Rockefeller family, here's the punchline, Rockefeller family is heavily invested in drug companies. In other words, here's a situation you have in Sterling and other drug companies. So in other words, you have a situation where one wing of the Rockefeller empire, the Rockefeller Foundation, in the name of, quote, science, unquote, gets all competitors to allopathy outlawed, runs the hospitals, medical schools, etc., gets the competitors outlawed, and then that only synthetic drugs become viable or become legal, and then they make profits out of synthetic drugs through the Rockefeller's investment in synthetic drug companies. That's the racket. That's the basic systemic racket here. That's the way the Rockefeller forces operate. So it's a beautiful alliance between so-called value-free science, value-free medicine, and the Rockefeller economic interests. And it's still going on. Basically, this is the whole, and the thing which really annoys me almost more than anything else is the argument they give against people like Rovici and people like things like Laissez-Faire is, they don't say it's harmful, these so-called crackpot therapies. They say it wastes the patient's, the consumer's dollar, spends their money unnecessarily. Well, I mean, first of all, it's a lot of gall for these goddamn doctors who are charging an arm and a leg to worry about the consumer's pocketbook after they're pillaging it. What they're really worrying about is other therapies are cheaper, regardless of whether they're effective or ineffective. Crackpot therapies are always much cheaper than orthodox medical therapies. And the consumer should have a right to be able to choose it. Anyway, that's my sermon for today. And so another thing you have is, with the medical, one of the things that the Flexner Report did, interestingly enough, is to outlaw proprietary hospitals, which are more or less illegal until quite recently. In other words, a proprietary hospital cannot be a medical school. And of course, medical schools become the key hospitals. They have unpaid, exploited labor through interns and things like that. So, in other words, the only legitimate hospital becomes not a proprietary one, but essentially a producer's co-op. A proprietary hospital is a profit-making hospital. Why should doctors who are conservative and everything else, why are they against proprietary hospitals? Why should they claim it's somehow evil to have a hospital that makes money? Which is really what they're saying. Doctors' hospital makes money. Most of the big hospitals are non-profit making. In other words, they're owned by the trustees. They get their money from donations by wealthy philanthropists, and they're run by the doctors themselves. It's like colleges. Colleges are run by a trustee outfit, and not the faculty, but essentially they're not owned by anybody. They're run by trustees, and therefore there's no responsibility of ownership. You don't have to make a profit. As long as you don't go bankrupt, you're pegging along forever. So not nearly as efficient as profit-making outfits. Well, the result of this, where hospitals are basically not profit-making, but run by trustees and by the doctors themselves take over. They seize power. The result of this is, if the hospital isn't exactly bankrupt, what happens is the doctors take over, and the doctors push their own interests. What are their own interests? Well, high salaries, and also sexy equipment. In other words, if you're a doctor, you want to make a name for yourself. How do you make a name for yourself? You don't go around treating colds, right? Every schmuck has a cold. Nothing sexy about a cold. What's sexy is a rare disease only found in northern New Guinea. And you try to get your hospital to have the only machine in the world, $10 billion machine. It's the only machine that can cure this disease, which one person gets every 100 years. This is exaggeration, but basically what it is. In other words, hospitals then compete. They overload in very expensive equipment for rare diseases. They forget about it. They try to play down important common diseases. So in other words, because the interest then, it's not the interest of the consumer that counts, or since there are no owners, it's the interest of the doctors themselves in promoting their own glory. And so, as I say, it's too much equipment, there's an overuse of equipment, sophisticated equipment, right? And equipment for its own sake, for high tech for its own sake, so to speak. And forgetting about the patient, it comes last in this whole machine. Because they don't get their income so much from the patient, they get their incomes from donations from wealthy philanthropists. And of course now with medical insurance, since the 50s and 60s with Medicare and Blue Cross and everything, they get almost nothing from the patients. The patients are guaranteed by the insurance companies. They charge almost as much as they want. I mean, within limits. So the demand curve goes up, way up. In other words, the supply is restricted by law. And the demand curve goes way up because it's pushed by government insurance proposals. You wind up with almost unlimited funds for the doctors. I mean, hospital costs are enormous compared to what they used to be. They've increased by 100-fold in the last 10 years or so. It's not because of inflation, it's because of the artificial increase in demand by the third-party insurance, especially government, and a restriction of supply by government. Now, this restriction of supply has been loosening up. What's happened is It got so bad that people began to, the so-called paramedics began to come in. In other words, people who are slightly illegal paramedics, because doctors become so scarce they turn to nurses or para types. And people begin to realize, for example, to get an injection, so you get a blood test or something. If you go to an orthodox doctor, you have to pay $80 or something for one lousy injection. Doctors aren't good injectors because they only give one injection a day or something. Nurses usually do it a lot. Nurses are much better at injections or taking blood tests than doctors are. Why should you have to pay a high-priced doctor? Why can't you go to a low-priced nurse? And so more and more of this is happening now, where paramedics come in who are specialists in a certain area and are much cheaper and are able to outcompete. And a lot of this has brought also in the last 20 years or so, there's been a healthy reevaluation of the medical profession. People are going to realize they're not divine, they're not God, they haven't got God's imprimatur. They're people like everybody else, in fact slightly worse because they got a government monopoly behind them. And so therefore they should be looked at with a cold and sober eye. And the whole idea that people really should run their own bodies and not the doctors is also coming to the fore. All this is very healthy. It's a good reaction against the usual authoritarian submission of your life to the doctor. Anyway, so the punchline here is that the Rockefeller Institute, Rockefeller family benefits from their synthetic drug investments through pushing allopathy and outlawing competing therapies. And similar, in addition to this, I talked about prohibition, we have the purity movement. The idea of purity, remember I talked about Dr. Wiley and his obsession with purity. Purity comes in now as a combination, just like prohibition, it's a combination of alleged value-free science and pietist values. Life should be purified. Prostitution should be outlawed. The whole idea, there was no, generally before about 1900, before the progressive era, prostitutes were there all the time anyway. They've never been eliminated. So if anything, they were sort of put into a red light district. So they were sort of an invisible area and regulated and so forth. And what happens in a market situation is it's important to have brand names of prostitution. Since the individual prostitute is a sort of shifting, high turnover in the prostitute profession. And so if you have brand names like Madams, they supply a brand name for the customers. Well, the progressive era had a hysterical attack on prostitution through purity, through pietist purity, and through progressive upper-class WASP alleged science. And they were considered to be centers of disease and so forth. So prostitution was then illegal. Purity drives against prostitutes in every city. As a result, the brothels were eliminated or outlawed, and the girls were driven onto the streets. We have no quality control whatsoever. So the disease, of course, increases because there's no madam saying, I guarantee the purity or health of these girls. So as a result, the problem became worse, but the progressives don't care about that. So what you have in the anti-prostitution movement, you have the pietist doctors, progressive doctors, plus social hygienists, and vice commissions, reformers, urban reformers, the whole gang, all these people I've been talking about, unite in things like this. In 1911, one of the progressive guys, the federal government passed the Mann Act, which outlaws transporting women across state lines for immoral purposes. So it's really enforced, tough to enforce it, but every once in a while, of course, these things are enforced. And according to Mencken's view was, and it might be true, that this was passed by the envious farmers who didn't have any cars. They were stuck to the hay rock, because in other words, farmers transport girls only within the state line. They only have hay wagons, so they didn't have automobiles. This is an attack by crummy farmers against envious of their urban competitors, urban types that can drive across the state. So they wanted to crush. It wasn't really an attack on immorality; it was an attack on immorality across state lines. So who knows? It might be right, but it hasn't been studied enough. The whole Mann Act agitation should be studied from this revisionist point of view. There's a social hygiene movement, which is part of this whole thing, which combines all the people we love here. The pietists, value-free physicians, value-free scientists. There's a whole stew of these characters, all of whom combine to stamp out. Also, the idea was you stamp out prostitution as well as you stamp out liquor, you will improve the morals of the masses, and they'll work harder, and they'll become more cleaner and more, and all the rest of it. Vote WASP. And of course, the theory was that, again, you were attacking ethnics. The theory was there are no WASP prostitutes. Of course, it's incorrect. I mean, it was part of a whole the whole struggle between these groups. And the same guys pop up, by the way. I mean, for example, when I was growing up, Dr. Raymond Fosdick was beloved. There were certain people who were beloved. By beloved, I mean people who were beloved in the media, New York Times, Washington Post, CBS, Time Magazine. And one of them was Dr. Raymond Fosdick, who pops up everywhere. I think he was a Rockefeller Foundation physician, head of the American Social Hygiene Association of Stamp Out Prostitution. He was everywhere. He's also, I think, the brother of Dr. Harry Emerson Fosdick, pietist minister at Riverside Church. He's also president of the Rockefeller Foundation. These people are everywhere. They're sort of the whole network. He's the official biographer of John D. Rockefeller Jr. John D. Rockefeller Jr., by the way, did the following thing. He was the only son of John D. Sr. He set up the Bureau of Social Hygiene in 1911 to stamp out sin, stamp out prostitution and everything else, pornography, etc. Put in $5 million for so-called scientific social reform. He wanted to stamp out liquor, and so he had a prohibition movement. He sponsored Flexner's Flexner report, also sent Flexner to Europe to try to stamp out sin in Europe. He also he got Fosdick, who's sort of Mr. Rockefeller in those days, Mr. Rockefeller in the social field. He got Fosdick to investigate, have a scientific police system, helping set up the FBI, getting files on everybody. This is part, of course, of pietist reform. In other words, part of the things you do is you have fingerprints of everybody and files on everybody, so you make sure you can regulate people. Also, he helped set up the federal drug policy. This whole multi-billion-dollar war on drugs is going on. Really starts around World War I. Before it starts with John D. Rockefeller Jr. and the idea of stamping out drugs. By the way, one interesting thing is the pietists were so anti-liquor that they were promoting the idea of taking cocaine in order to stop liquor. The idea is that anything is better than liquor. Of course, this attitude has shifted recent years. Also, they're in favor. All these guys are in favor of stamping out pornography and having censorship and making sure that everything is all press and all publications are moral, etc., etc. You can imagine who decides what's moral or not. It's another can of worms. So all this really comes in the progressive period. In the progressive period, during World War I, as we'll get to a little later, World War I was supposed to be the culmination of all this stuff. They outlaw, in order to save American boys from liquor, they outlawed liquor. In other words, prohibition comes in World War I to save American soldiers from liquor. The same way they're stamping out the brothels in order to save American soldiers from sin. Starting with the famous federal government seizure and eradication of Storyville, the famous New Orleans red light district, and the closing down of Storyville by the federal troops in World War I. And all this, as I say, was backed by scientific value-free doctors and pietists and this whole alliance, which culminates in the Progressive Party, as we'll see in 1912. What happened after 2 terms of Theodore Roosevelt, 1908, his successor, William Howard Taft, who had been a judge, Supreme Court judge, and Secretary of War, was an old pal of Roosevelt's. And one of these things, if you pass on something to your successors, often happens in life, by the way, in business and in unions. For example, David Dubinsky was a beloved head of the American International Ladies Garment Workers Union for about 60 years. In the union movement, once a union president, always a union president. Famous motto in the labor union movement. At any rate, so when Dubinsky finally retired at the age of 70, he passed on the chairmanship to his old buddy and right-hand man, Louis Stillberg. And he expected Stillberg would be his shadow. In other words, he would issue orders from his retirement home, and Stillberg would follow. Stillberg starts, after all, Stillberg wanted to do something on his own. There's immediately a bitter clash between him and Dubinsky. In a couple of years, they wouldn't speak to each other, battling and so forth and so on. So when Taft gets in as president in 1908, I guess they forgot that he was a Ohio Republican. As a Ohio Republican, he was essentially in the Rockefeller camp. And he starts a savage, bitter attack on the Morgans. In other words, essentially it was a Rockefeller retaliation for the Morgan savage attack by Teddy Roosevelt. And so we have, we'll get, next time I'll go into the Taft cabinet, etc. But we have then Taft rolling out the antitrust arm, filing antitrust suits like mad against the Morgans, against International Harvester and U.S. Steel. They didn't succeed, but it was a bitter fight. In other words, here's Teddy Roosevelt, a Morgan person, trying to smash Standard Oil, attacking Standard Oil, and here's Taft as a response, as a retaliation for this, going after the Morgan trusts. And it was on that basis, because Taft being anti-Morgan, Teddy Roosevelt broke with him. Teddy Roosevelt was in Africa on safari or something, and he says, he's writing letters back, hysterical letters, saying Taft is evil, he's monster, he's crushing poor Morgan. And on that basis, Teddy Roosevelt breaks with Morgan. And the Morgans then decide to punish Taft forever. In other words, to destroy the Republican Party temporarily in order to crush Taft and prevent him from being reelected in 1912. So for the election of 1912, the Morgans create a new party, a new third party, a very powerful third party, at least for a short period of time, the Progressive Party. And in the Progressive Party, we culminate all the progressive aspects. The Progressive Party was filled with almost all of the upper-class WASPs. They were Morgan people, there were social workers, there were Jane Addams, all these people I've been talking about, my least favorite people in the world, collected in the Progressive Party. Pietists, hymn singers, so-called value-free scientists, physicians, shrinks, social workers, they're all in the Progressive Party. Also, by the way, women's suffrage. Remember I said that women's suffrage was essentially a pietist maneuver to beat out the ethnics. Women delegates at the Progressive Party Convention in 1912 for the first time in the history of American politics. They had women, this is before women's suffrage, which comes in only 1920 on the federal level. They had a lot of women delegates, and the New York Times, which was a Democratic newspaper in those days, the Progressive Party met in 1912 in New York City, and they said they couldn't believe it. The guy reported on it. They said, this is not like a political convention, it's like a religious revival meeting, which indeed it was. Teddy Roosevelt was giving an address to the inaugural address or whatever, keynote address to the Progressive Party Convention. He's using religious, pietist phraseology. He talks about, his famous climactic, at the end he says, we stand at Armageddon and we battle for the Lord. In other words, this is Armageddon. The election of 1912 is Armageddon. And all throughout his speech was punctuated with amens from the floor and hymn singing, constantly breaking into hymns. They sang a hymn, we will follow, follow, follow Roosevelt, substituting the word Roosevelt for Jesus in the famous Protestant hymn. So the whole thing was a hymn-singing revival meeting rather than an Orthodox political convention. Progressive Party arrived. Progressive Party was created by the Morgan interests. The head of the Progressive Party, the Secretary-Treasurer, the guy who really ran it, was none other than our old pal, George W. Perkins, Morgan partner, who brings Teddy Roosevelt out of retirement, uses all these crackpot technocrats and pietists to smash Taft, bring back Roosevelt and run against Taft, and destroy Taft's re-nomination, which he did. In other words, re-election. Taft was nominated by the Republican Party. Teddy Roosevelt was nominated by the Progressive Party. Teddy Roosevelt got more votes than Taft did.